Ridge Mountains, Virginia, 1891. The day Walter Hensley's father told him to leave was the same day the dogwoods bloomed across the valley, their white petals falling like snow onto the green spring grass. Walter would remember that detail for the rest of his life. How something so beautiful could happen at the exact moment his world fell apart. "You're not my son anymore," Franklin Hensley said, his voice flat as a judge reading a sentence. "You've shamed this family enough. Take what you can carry, and don't come back." Walter stood in the parlor of the house where he'd been born 26 years earlier, surrounded by the furniture his grandfather had built and the portraits of ancestors who stared down at him with painted disapproval. His mother sat in the corner, crying silently, unable or unwilling to contradict her husband. His two brothers flanked their father like soldiers, their faces carrying the same cold certainty. The crime that had earned Walter's banishment was simple. He had fallen in love with the wrong woman. Sarah Meadows was a seamstress from the valley, the daughter of a farmer who rented land from a neighbor. In the rigid hierarchy of Virginia society, she was beneath the Hensleys in every way that mattered to people who measured worth by acreage and bloodlines. Walter had proposed to her anyway, and when his father discovered the engagement, the explosion had been immediate and absolute. "I won't change my mind," Walter said quietly. "I love her." "Then love her somewhere else. You're not bringing that woman into this family." "She has a name, Sarah, and she's going to be my wife whether you approve or not." Franklin Hensley's face reddened, a vein pulsing in his temple. "Then you'll be her husband without a penny of Hensley money, without an acre of Hensley land, without the Hensley name. I'll see you written out of every document, every will, every record. You'll be nothing." Walter looked at his mother one last time, hoping for some sign of support, some crack in the wall of family solidarity. She wouldn't meet his eyes. "I was always nothing to you," Walter said. "At least now it's honest." He walked out of the house with a single bag over his shoulder, passing the blooming dogwoods without seeing them, heading toward the small cabin where Sarah waited, without knowing that their future had just been decided for them. They married 3 days later, in a ceremony attended by Sarah's family and none of Walter's. The celebration was modest: fiddle music, home-cooked food, dancing on a wooden floor that creaked with every step. But Walter had never felt happier. He had lost everything except the one thing that mattered. The problem was practical. They had nowhere to live. Sarah's family cabin was already crowded with her parents and 4 younger siblings. Walter's skills as a gentleman farmer were useless without land to farm. The money he'd saved, a few $100s that his father couldn't touch, would last perhaps 6 months if they were careful. "We could go west," Sarah suggested on their wedding night, lying beside him in the small room her parents had given them. "They say there's land in Kansas, in Nebraska. Free land for anyone willing to work it." "And leave your family? Leave Virginia?" "I'd leave anywhere for you." Walter pulled her close, overwhelmed by the gift of her loyalty. "There's another option, something I've been thinking about." "Tell me." "The mountains. Up past the valley, where the old timber claims are. Nobody farms up there because the land's too steep and rocky. But a man could build a cabin, hunt and trap, maybe find work in the lumber camps. It's not much, but it's close enough that you could still see your family." Sarah was quiet for a moment, considering. "You'd be giving up everything you know. Fancy houses, servants, society parties. You'd be living like a hermit." "I'd be living with you. That's not giving up anything. That's getting everything I want." They left for the mountains the following week, their possessions loaded onto a mule that Sarah's father gave them as a wedding present. The valley people watched them go with pity in their eyes. The disgraced gentleman and his seamstress wife, heading into wilderness that would surely break them. Walter looked back once, at the rolling farmland where he'd grown up, at the Hensley estates visible on the distant hillside. Then he turned his face toward the mountains and didn't look back again. The first year was harder than Walter had imagined, and he had imagined it being very hard indeed. They found a spot high on the mountain's eastern face, where a natural spring bubbled from the rocks, and the slope flattened briefly into something approaching level ground. The view was spectacular. 50 miles of valley spread out below them, hazy with morning mist and golden with evening light. But you couldn't eat a view, and the land seemed determined to resist every attempt at habitation. Walter built their first shelter from fallen logs and canvas, a crude structure that leaked when it rained and barely held heat when the wind blew. They ate what he could hunt, squirrels at first, then rabbits, finally a deer that kept them fed for weeks. Sarah planted a garden that the rocky soil tried to reject, coaxing vegetables from ground that seemed personally offended by agriculture. This was a mistake, Walter said one evening in late autumn, staring at the pitiful cabin that represented 3 months of back-breaking labor. I've brought you to nothing. Sarah looked up from the shirt she was mending by firelight. You've brought me to freedom. You've brought me to a home that's ours, not borrowed or rented or held over our heads. You've brought me to a life where we decide what matters, not your father or society or anyone else. It's a shack. You deserve better. I deserve a husband who loves me. I have one. Everything else is details. Walter wanted to argue, to wallow in the self-pity that kept trying to swallow him. But Sarah wouldn't allow it. She never allowed it. And gradually, her stubborn optimism began to seem less like denial and more like wisdom. They survived the winter, barely. When spring came, Walter started building again, this time with a clearer vision of what he wanted to create. The house that would eventually make Walter Hensley famous began as a simple expansion of their original shack. He added a room, then another, learning from each mistake, developing techniques suited to the mountain's peculiar demands. The slope was his greatest challenge. Traditional construction assumed flat ground, square corners, level foundations. The mountain offered none of these things. A house built the normal way would either require massive excavation or would perch precariously on supports that the first heavy snow would destroy. Walter's solution came from watching the mountain itself. The ancient rocks hadn't fought the slope. They'd embraced it, finding angles of repose where gravity became an ally rather than an enemy. Trees grew at angles that seemed impossible, their roots gripping the mountainside with a tenacity that no carpenter's nail could match. What if a house could do the same thing? He began experimenting with terraced construction, building rooms at different levels that followed the natural contour of the land. Instead of fighting the slope, he incorporated it. A living room that looked out over the valley, a kitchen set 3 feet higher into the hillside, bedrooms carved partially into the rock itself. Each level connected to the next through short stairways that felt as natural as walking on the mountain paths. The rocks he'd cursed during that first terrible year became his primary building material. He gathered them from the slopes above, selecting each stone for its shape and character, fitting them together like a 3-dimensional puzzle. The walls that emerged were 2 feet thick in places, massive enough to hold heat in winter and stay cool in summer, strong enough to resist any wind the mountain could throw. Sarah watched the transformation with amazement that gradually became participation. She designed the interior layout, suggesting windows where Walter would have built solid walls, creating spaces that captured light and framed views that took visitors' breath away. Her seamstress eye for proportion and balance translated surprisingly well to architecture. "The fireplace should be there," she said one afternoon, pointing to what seemed like an arbitrary spot on the floor plan Walter had sketched. "Not centered, offset. So the light comes through that window and the fire at the same angle. It'll make the whole room glow." Walter built the fireplace where she indicated. When they lit the first fire that autumn, the room glowed exactly as she'd predicted. The construction continued through seasons, each one teaching them something new. Spring brought rains that tested every joint and seal, revealing weaknesses that Walter corrected before summer arrived. Summer allowed the most productive building, long days of hauling stone and shaping timber. Autumn was for finishing work, the detailed carpentry and stonework that transformed a structure into a home. Winter was for planning, for sitting by that offset fireplace and sketching next year's additions. By the end of the second year, the house had grown to 4 rooms on 3 levels, with a root cellar dug into the mountain and a covered porch that Sarah called the best room we have. They had a proper kitchen now, with a cast iron stove that Walter had hauled up the mountain piece by piece. They had a bedroom with a real bed frame and a mattress stuffed with dried grass and wool that Sarah had carded herself. The valley people still pitied them, still shook their heads when they heard about those Hensleys up on the mountain. But the pity was beginning to mix with something else. Curiosity, perhaps, or the first stirrings of doubt about their own certainties. Sarah's younger brother, Jacob, made the climb one summer day, bringing supplies and news from the valley. He spent 3 days with them, helping Walter with a stone wall and marveling at what his sister's husband had created. "It's not what I expected," Jacob admitted on his last evening, sitting on the porch and watching the sun set over the valley. "When you two left, everyone said you'd be back within a year, said the mountain would break you." "The mountain didn't break us," Sarah replied, leaning against Walter's shoulder. "It made us." "I can see that." Jacob was quiet for a moment. "There's talk in the valley, you know. People asking questions about how you built this, whether the same techniques could work on the hills above Thompson's farm. Old man Warren even said he might climb up here to see for himself." Walter laughed. "Let him come. The trail's open to anyone willing to walk it." The first visitor, who wasn't family, arrived in the spring of 1894, 3 years after Walter and Sarah had fled to the mountains. He was a surveyor named Douglas Crawford, mapping the region for a timber company that was considering expansion into the higher elevations. Crawford had heard rumors of a madman building something strange on the upper slopes, the kind of story that passed between lumber camp workers late at night, embellished with each retelling, until the madman became a wizard and his house became a castle in the clouds. The reality, Crawford discovered, was more impressive than any legend. "My God," he said, standing in the clearing that Walter had carved from the forest over 3 years of patient work. "What is this place?" The house rose from the mountainside in terraced levels, its stone walls blending with the rocks around them so seamlessly that it seemed to have grown there rather than been built. Windows caught the morning light at angles that made the whole structure gleam. A wooden porch wrapped around the front, cantilevered over the slope in a way that seemed to defy gravity, offering an unobstructed view of the valley below. Walter emerged from the front door, wiping his hands on a work apron. He was leaner than he'd been in his gentleman days, harder and more weathered, but his eyes carried a contentment that Crawford had rarely seen in any man. "Just a house," Walter said. "Nothing special. Can I help you with something?" Crawford spent 3 hours exploring the property, asking questions that Walter answered with the patient enthusiasm of a craftsman discussing his work. The surveyor learned about terraced construction and stone selection, about passive heating and natural ventilation, about windows positioned to capture specific views at specific times of day. "You should be building houses for other people," Crawford said as he prepared to leave. This is remarkable work. I know wealthy men in Richmond who would pay a fortune for something like this. Walter shook his head. I build for myself and my wife. That's enough. At least let me tell people about this place. Let me write about it for the architectural journals. People should know what's possible up here. Walter glanced at Sarah, who had joined them on the porch. She shrugged slightly, leaving the decision to him. Write what you want, Walter said finally. I can't stop you. But I'm not building for anyone else. This mountain has enough people on it already. Crawford wrote his article anyway, and it was published in the Virginia Architectural Review that autumn. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Letters arrived at the Valley Post Office addressed to Walter Hensley, mountain builder. Dozens at first, then hundreds, from architects and builders and curious citizens across the eastern states. Most asked questions about specific techniques. Some offered money for consultations. A few proposed partnerships that would have made Walter wealthy if he'd accepted them. He answered the technical questions and ignored the rest. You could be rich, Sarah pointed out one evening, sorting through another pile of letters. This one's from a banker in Philadelphia. He wants you to design a mountain retreat for his family. Says he'll pay whatever you ask. We have everything we need. We have everything we need right now. What about Eleanor? What about her future? Walter looked at his wife, recognizing the practical concern behind her words. They had built a good life, but it was a fragile one, dependent on his continued health and the mountain's continued cooperation. A single bad winter, a serious illness, a fire, any of these could destroy what they had created. I'll think about it, he said. And for the first time, he meant it. The visitors started arriving that winter, making the treacherous mountain climb despite snow and cold, driven by curiosity and the architectural drawings that Crawford had included in his article. They came in ones and twos at first, then in larger groups, all wanting to see the mountain house that the journals were calling a new form of American architecture. Walter turned most of them away at the property line, politely but firmly refusing to let strangers into his home. But some were more persistent than others, and a few became friends despite Walter's initial resistance. Thomas Whitmore was a builder from Charlottesville who had read Crawford's article and made the climb specifically to learn. Unlike the curiosity seekers and society tourists, Whitmore asked intelligent questions and listened carefully to the answers. The terracing technique, Whitmore said during his third visit, examining the foundation of a new workshop Walter was constructing. Could it work on a gentler slope? Say, the hills around Charlottesville? Could work anywhere there's slope, Walter replied. The principle's the same whether it's steep or gentle. You're working with the land instead of against it. Would you consider consulting? Just advice, nothing more. I've got a client who wants to build on a hillside lot that everyone says is impossible. Everyone's wrong. No lot is impossible. Just takes different thinking. Walter visited the Charlottesville site the following month, his first trip off the mountain in nearly 4 years. The hillside lot was challenging, but far from impossible. A simple application of the techniques he'd developed would create a beautiful home with views that a flat lot could never offer. He provided sketches and advice, refusing payment despite Whitmore's insistence. I don't want your money, Walter said. I want you to build it right. That's payment enough. Whitmore built it right. The house was featured in 3 architectural publications, and suddenly Walter Hensley's name was being spoken in circles that had never heard of his family's Virginia estate. The irony wasn't lost on anyone who knew the story. The son, who had been cast out for shaming his family, was becoming famous for the very skills that disgrace had forced him to develop.
The man who had retreated to the mountains to escape society was being celebrated by that same society as a visionary. Franklin Hensley heard about his son's rising reputation through the gossip networks that connected Virginia's wealthy families.
The news arrived like salt in a wound he tried to convince himself had healed. "They say he's building something remarkable up there," reported a business associate who didn't know the family history. "Some new kind of architecture that works with the mountains instead of against them. European architects are studying it, apparently." Franklin said nothing, but that night he sat alone in his study, staring at the portrait of his grandfather and wondering whether he had made a terrible mistake. He had 2 other sons, both respectable, both married to women of appropriate breeding, both producing grandchildren who would carry the Hensley name forward in the proper fashion. But neither of them had ever built anything. Neither of them had ever created something that made strangers travel hundreds of miles just to see it. Walter had done that with nothing but his hands and his determination, and the love of a seamstress who was, Franklin was beginning to admit, exactly the kind of wife his son had needed. Sarah gave birth to their first child in the spring of 1896, a daughter they named Eleanor, after Sarah's mother. The baby arrived during a thunderstorm that shook the mountain house to its foundations, and Walter delivered her himself because the doctor couldn't make the climb in time. "She's perfect," Sarah said, exhausted but radiant, holding the tiny bundle that represented everything they had built together. "Look at her, Walter. She's perfect." Walter looked at his daughter, at the woman who had followed him into wilderness without hesitation, at the home they had created from rock and wood and stubborn hope. He thought about his father's words on that spring day 5 years ago. "You'll be nothing," and smiled. "We're perfect," he said. "All 3 of us." The following year brought more visitors, more requests for consultation, more articles in journals that Walter never read. Thomas Whitmore had built 3 more houses using the techniques Walter had taught him, and each one brought more attention to the mountain where those techniques had been born. "They want you to come to Richmond," Whitmore told Walter during one of his regular visits. "The Virginia Society of Architects. They want to give you an award, some kind of recognition for innovation in design." "I'm not going to Richmond." "Walter, these are important people. This could mean real opportunities. I have opportunities here. I have my family, my home, my work. What would I want in Richmond that I don't already have?" Whitmore couldn't answer that question, because there was no answer. Walter had everything he wanted. The people who had rejected him had done him an enormous favor. They had freed him from a life of expectations and obligations that would have suffocated the creativity now being celebrated around the world. Franklin Hensley made the climb in September 1898, 7 years after he had cast his son out of the family. He was 64 years old, and the mountain trail nearly killed him, but he refused to turn back despite the protests of his aging body. He found Walter splitting wood outside the house that had made him famous, the same steady rhythm that Walter had learned as a boy and never forgotten despite years of gentleman's education. Father and son stared at each other across the clearing, years of silence stretching between them. "You came," Walter said finally. It was neither welcome nor accusation, just observation. "I had to see it," Franklin replied. "What you built." "You want a tour?" "If you'll give me one." Walter showed his father through the house, explaining the techniques and principles that had guided its construction. Franklin listened without interrupting, his builder's eye recognizing quality that transcended any personal feelings between them. "Your mother wanted to come," Franklin said when the tour was finished. They stood on the porch that Walter had cantilevered over the valley, the same view that had attracted Douglas Crawford and Thomas Whitmore and hundreds of visitors since. "I told her I needed to come alone first." "Why?" Franklin was quiet for a long moment, his eyes on the distant valley where the Hensley estate was invisible but present, a ghost on the horizon. Because I needed to apologize without an audience. What I did to you was wrong. What I said was wrong. I was protecting something that didn't matter while destroying something that did. Walter waited, offering neither forgiveness nor rejection, just patient attention. You built something here that will outlast any of us, Franklin continued. The houses, yes, but more than that. A life. A real life, with meaning and purpose and love. I tried to take that from you, and you found it anyway. His voice cracked slightly. I'm proud of you, Walter. I should have said it years ago. You should have. I'm saying it now, for whatever that's worth. Walter looked at his father, the old man who had seemed so powerful and absolute in that parlor 7 years ago, now diminished by age and regret, and a mountain trail that had demanded more than he had to give. It's worth something, Walter said. Come inside. Sarah's making dinner, and Eleanor should meet her grandfather. They walked into the house together, the prodigal father welcomed by the son he had cast out, both of them changed by time and circumstance, and the unexpected paths that life insists on taking. The dinner was awkward at first, decades of silence not easily broken by a single conversation. But Eleanor, now 2 years old, had no knowledge of family grudges or social expectations. She climbed into her grandfather's lap with the fearless confidence of a child who had never learned to distrust strangers. And Franklin Hensley, the stern patriarch who had cast out his own son, melted like spring snow. She has your mother's eyes, Franklin said, his voice thick with emotion. The same green. She has her own eyes, Sarah replied, not unkindly. Everything else she'll have to earn herself. The old man visited 3 more times before his death in 1901. Each visit was easier than the last, the wounds healing slowly but genuinely. He met his grandson William, born in 1899, and held the boy with the tenderness of a man trying to correct past mistakes through present kindness. Walter's mother Martha made the climb once, in the spring of 1900, a journey that nearly killed her, but that she insisted on completing. She spent a week in the mountain house, crying often, apologizing repeatedly, trying to compress years of regret into a few short days. I should have spoken up, she told Walter on her last evening. When your father said those things, I should have defended you. I was a coward. You were his wife. You did what wives did then. That's not an excuse. It's barely an explanation. She gripped his hands with surprising strength. Promise me something, Walter. Promise me you'll never let duty to family override love for family. They're not the same thing, and I learned that too late. I promise, Mother. She died the following winter, and Walter made the journey down from the mountain to attend her funeral. He stood beside his brothers, all of them middle-aged now, all of them strangers despite shared blood. They shook hands afterward with the formal politeness of business associates, and Walter climbed back up his mountain and never saw them again. The years that followed brought expansion of the house, of Walter's reputation, of the family that filled the mountain home with noise and laughter, and the chaos of children growing up wild and free. A second daughter, Margaret, arrived in 1902. A third son, Thomas, in 1905. The house grew to accommodate them, new rooms sprouting from the original structure like branches from a tree, each one following the mountain's contours, each one designed by Walter and Sarah together. Thomas Whitmore continued building houses using Walter's techniques, training apprentices who spread across Virginia and beyond. The Hensley method became a recognized term in architectural circles, taught in universities, and practiced by builders who had never met the man who invented it. Walter finally accepted payment for his consultations in 1908, when Eleanor was 12 and showing the first signs of her own interest in design. He used the money to buy books and drafting supplies, to hire a tutor who made the climb twice weekly, to give his children opportunities that the mountain couldn't provide on its own. "Education is the one thing they can't take away from you," he told Sarah. "I learned that when Father threw me out. My knowledge came with me. Everything else stayed behind." The children grew up knowing both worlds, the mountain that was their home and the valley that represented everything their father had left behind. Eleanor made the choice to bridge them, studying architecture at a time when women weren't welcome in the profession, fighting battles that made her father's struggles seem almost simple by comparison. "You could have an easier life," Walter told her when she announced her intention to apply to the University of Virginia's architecture program. "Marry well, settle down, let someone else fight these battles." "Could you have an easier life?" Eleanor replied. "Could you have stayed in the valley, married someone appropriate, been the son your father wanted?" "No, I couldn't." "Then you understand why I can't either." Walter Hensley continued building until his death in 1934 at the age of 69. His mountain house still stands today, preserved as a historical landmark and studied by architecture students from around the world. The terraced construction techniques he pioneered have been adapted for hillside building across 5 continents. Sarah outlived him by 12 years, remaining in the mountain house they had built together, surrounded by children and grandchildren who carried forward the Hensley name, a name that now meant something very different than it had in Franklin's day. Eleanor Hensley became an architect herself, the first woman admitted to the Virginia Society of Architects, carrying her father's innovations into a new century. She designed hospitals and schools and homes for working families, buildings that followed the land's contours and served their occupants, rather than impressing their neighbors. The Hensley estate in the valley was sold in 1952, the last of the family line there having moved away to cities where bloodlines mattered less than ability. The new owners converted it to a hotel, advertising its historic significance without mentioning that its most famous son had been thrown out for loving the wrong woman. But on the mountain, in the house that rejection built, Walter's legacy endured. Visitors still made the climb, still stood on the cantilevered porch, still marveled at walls that seemed to grow from the rock itself. They came to see architecture, but what they found was something more. A testament to what becomes possible when everything you thought you needed is taken away, leaving only what you actually need. The guest book in the visitor center contains thousands of entries, messages from architects and tourists and families who made the pilgrimage to see what one man built when the world told him he was worthless. Many of the messages say the same thing, variations on a theme that Walter would have appreciated. "I came here feeling stuck. I'm leaving feeling free. If he could build this from nothing, maybe I can too." This place proves that the people who reject you are often doing you a favor. Sarah's final entry in her diary, written a week before her death in 1946, captured it best. "Walter always said he built this house for me, but I think he built it for everyone who ever felt like they weren't enough. He built it to prove that enough is whatever you decide it is." The mountain house stands as that proof, stone and timber and glass arranged in patterns that follow the land's own logic. It is beautiful and functional and enduring, qualities that Walter cultivated in his buildings and in his life. Love, purpose, a beautiful view, and the stubborn determination to build something worth wanting, even when, especially when, the world tells you that you're nothing.